Hi friends, it's been a little while since I made my last video. Sorry, again I was busy with schoolwork. So anyway, today's video is about the Cold War. Many of you might have heard this term, Cold War, and you might have wondered what it means. See, the Cold War in history is basically the proxy war between the USSR and the USA. I've already made a video about how the USSR collapsed, so if you want to know more about that, you can go check out that video. So basically what happened is, the US, is a capitalist economist country, and the USSR is a communist country, the first communist country in the world. So I haven't actually told about the USSR's creation only in one video called the Russian Revolution. So I'll just shorten it and say, and if you want more detail you can go and watch that video. So what basically happened is, at the end of World War I, the Russians were unsatisfied because of the war. So they started a revolution to overthrow Nicholas II, the Emperor of Russia. So they were successful, and Lenin created the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, the USSR, also known as the Soviet Union. So there wasn't much problem between the East and the West, but everything started at the end of World War II. I've already made a video about that too, so you can check it out as well. So basically, the war happened between first France and Britain. Both of them fought, France fell, Britain was alone, and then the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor, bringing USA into the war. The Germans invaded Russia, bringing the USSR into the war, and now basically it is an all-out war, and Nazi Germany lost. Japan also lost with the dropping of the atomic bombs. So basically, after this, many new countries were formed, like independence. But what happened was, people were kind of not into imperialism anymore. You can guess, after 200 years of slavery, people would not want to stay with the empires. And the US and the USSR were not empires. They were like a democracy. Well, mostly the US. You can't actually say that Stalin was a Democrat, but the communist regime was still good. People had fairly good living standards. So the problem which happened was, everyone in the West was afraid that the communist principles from the USSR would come into the Western world. See, what happens is, communism says that everyone should get equal wages according to their needs and their responsibilities. So the capitalist countries were afraid, which means that power would be taken from their hands and that the systems would be completely changed. And the capitalist economies of the US and most of Western Europe wanted a capitalist economy. So they started getting something known as the Red Scare. The Red Scare means everyone in the Western Bloc were afraid that people from the Eastern Bloc would come and corrupt the countries. So to prevent this, the Cold War began in 1947. You might know that as the year that India was created, but it has nothing to do with India's independence or any other country's independence. Basically, at that year, they started being separated. The USSR and the USA went in the two separate ways, never coming to a formal conflict between each other, but in a type of proxy war. The US formed the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, or NATO. It was made using the North Atlantic Treaty, a military cooperation between most of Eastern Europe and the USA. And this was an open attempt to discredit the USSR, to make sure that all the Western countries were united against the communists. So the communists made their own alliance, the Warsaw Pact, called that because it was signed in Warsaw, the capital of Poland, mainly comprised of the USSR and all its puppet states in Eastern Europe. Fun fact, Even though communism actually states a democracy should be there, the USSR wasn't actually a democracy, nor were any of the communist regimes in other countries, because, well, the people there weren't into communism that much because they did not have that much money compared to everyone in the capitalist world. So every so often in the communist world, a revolution would come. Not so much in the Western world, only in the Eastern world, and the USSR would quash it. See, this was the first phase of the Cold War. It lasted roughly up until 1953, till Stalin's death. Stalin was a very cruel dictator, you can say the least. He killed everyone who opposed him, but he liked to keep the security of his countries in his own hands. He didn't want any of the communist states to become independent or go their separate ways. When countries tried rebelling, the countries in the Warsaw Pact, he would send the USSR troops to quash the rebellions, something that was seen not so well by the West. See, at this time, Germany was divided into two, East Germany and West Germany. West Germany, as you might guess, belonged to the capitalist side, while East Germany belonged to the communist side. The city of Berlin, which was inside of East Germany, was split into two parts, East Berlin and West Berlin. But the problem was, East Berlin was given all priorities by the USSR and West Berlin was blockaded. No supplies could flow there. This was like an open aggression. But all the Western Bloc just airlifted supplies. This period lasted from 1947 till 1949, when they came to a consensus again and lifted the blockade so that West Berlin could finally get supplies once again. But then we had some other revolutions. See, the US was so confident because there were no communists in the New World, meaning in the Americas. See, there were many places where communists were coming, but the US quashed everything except for one revolution, Cuba. Cuba was the first communist country in the New World. This actually made the US nervous. They had thought that North America and South America was so controlled by the US that the communists could never get an outpost there. But there we go. Cuba was now an outpost of the Russians. So what they did is US stationed nuclear weapons in NATO countries such as Turkey and Greece. So the USSR saw this as an open aggression. So they put missiles in Cuba. This was the start of the Cuban Missile Crisis. See, both sides were so scared and everyone was preparing for nuclear war. The western side was getting truly afraid, so was the eastern side. The nuclear missiles were just in your backyard. The US had nuclear weapons in Turkey, Italy, Germany and all the other countries, while the USSR had missiles in Cuba. This was truly going to end in a nuclear war. Right? Well, no. Thankfully, no. Both sides agreed that a nuclear war was too destructive and they decided to take away the bombs from Cuba and from Europe. So both of them started to normalize tensions. But something you might not know is that at that time a Soviet submarine was actually patrolling the seas around the US. They had lost communication with Moscow, so they thought that war had already been declared. That the USSR and the USA had already sent missiles towards each other. They had nuclear missiles on the submarine, so they were preparing to send a missile into the US. But thankfully, it was vetoed by their commander. If the commander had not vetoed that, a nuclear war would have started. And thankfully, that did not happen. Then we come to the close of the Cold War. Many people regard this phase as a turning point in the Cold War, where China and the Soviet Union split relations. China was also a newly communist state, coming from the communist revolutions in China. I might make a video about that one day. So the Chinese were communists, and China and Russia were friends, both being communists, the second largest communist country. But then they had the Sino-Soviet split. they had disagreements, and Russia and China formally split ways. Both were supportive of each other, but they didn't help each other. Then finally, in the 1980s and the 1990s, the Cold War started to draw to a close. The US and Russia were becoming friends, allies even, and with Mikhail Gorbachev becoming the leader of the USSR, things finally seemed to be restoring to normal. Freedom of press was granted. No more censorships. Everything was looking good in Russia. Until the Chernobyl nuclear crisis, of course. The nuclear plant in Chernobyl exploded, causing lots of deaths and lots of radiation. It was handled so poorly by the USSR that Mikhail Gorbachev tried to hush it up. When the people finally found out about this, they were furious. Mikhail Gorbachev had promised free press, but they had not announced this. So they got angry and protests began. This was the beginning of the end for the Eastern Bloc, or the Second World. The non-aligned countries and the First World were okay about this, but the communist world was slowly collapsing. Revolutions came in many of the Eastern communist countries such as Romania, Hungary, Albania, etc. And they had a falling out. Many communist countries started becoming capitalist. Many countries' revolutions succeeded. See, normally, before Gorbachev came as the leader, when a rebellion comes, the Soviet Union would just send in the army and quash the rebellion. But Mikhail Gorbachev refused to do this, saying that it was too violent. But because of that mistake, all the countries were able to gain independence and become capitalist nations. Then, of course, the President of the US and Mikhail Gorbachev had a meeting and announced the end of the Cold War. This is marked as the official end of the Cold War, but most historians say that it ended in 1991. In 1990, both the Germanys united, and in 1991, the USSR collapsed. I already made a video about it if you want to know more about it in detail. But after the USSR, the US reigned supreme, the most powerful country in the world. And now the only threats remaining to USA are China and Russia. But that story is yet to unfold. So thank you for watching. See you in the next video. Bye. Please like, share and subscribe.